Before the railways arrived, the time where you were was set locally by the rising and setting of the sun. This was called local mean time. There was no universal time in Britain, and, for instance, Reading was 4 minutes behind London, whilst Bristol and Bath were 11 minutes behind. It is commonly thought that the railways eliminated these variances, but the story is actually more complex. The railway alone did not change everything. The idea that there should be a standardisation of time in Britain was not new when the railways arrived. Abraham Foster Osler, a pioneer in the measurement of meteorological and chronological data, claimed that a Dr. William Hyde Wollaston, who had died in 1828, proposed that all post office clocks should be aligned. He considered that was this to be done, eventually all clocks would fall into line. But there was no urgent need before the railways arrived to standardise time, given that travellers could easily align their timepieces to the local time without much, if any, disruption. It is correct to say that the railways introduced more standardisation of time across Britain. Local time was not good for the railways. You needed trains starting out and leaving stations as well as meeting at other points, working on the same schedules to avoid collision and disruption. As such, timetables would pronounce that all trains would keep London time. In 1842, the Railway Clearing-House, that coordinated different elements of railway operation between companies, recommended that companies adopt Greenwich Mean Time. Yet, in the day-to-day lives of individuals, the railways alone cannot be credited with standardising all time. The railways did bring a standard time-mindedness across the nation, and many cities, when the railways arrived, did go over to railway time. Nonetheless, tensions emerged with local people who wanted to hold on to their long-established practices and day-to-day ways of working. Railway time was seen in some places as a metropolitan invasion to be resisted. By 1852, many major towns had not yet adopted Greenwich time. For instance, Cambridge, Oxford, Portsmouth, Wolverhampton, and places in the West Country such as Bath, Bristol, Plymouth and Totnes. In the case of Bristol, when the railways arrived, the local time was kept and a second hand was added to the clock on the Exchange to indicate London time. The Dean of Exeter Cathedral also refused to accept railway time, keeping the cathedral clock 14 minutes behind London time. That so many locations continued to use local time suggests that the impact of the railways was not universal. Indeed, it was the telegraph and not the railway that gave the final push for some places to fall into line. In 1852, a telegraph link had been constructed between a new electromagnetic clock at Greenwich and Lewisham. This was then connected to London Bridge Station and then to the City of London, allowing the transmission of a time signal along the railway telegraphic network to other stations. Telegraph had arrived in Bristol in early 1852, and soon the business it was doing was considerable, especially in the sending and receiving of stock market information, news reports, and details of parliamentary proceedings. This raised an issue in people's minds. Because local time remained in Bristol, this meant that information coming from London arrived 10 minutes before they were purported to have been dispatched. Consequently, to iron out this administrative, legal and commercial problem, in September 1852, the Town Council voted to adopt Greenwich time by 27 votes to 3. In Exeter, in the same year, similar occurred. Some individuals had been campaigning for the adoption of Greenwich time for some time before 1852. Yet it was only after the telegraph was completed to the station in August 1852 that, after some debate, the Dean of the Cathedral relented in November. By 1855, regular time signals were being sent the length and breadth of Britain. This led to the further standardisation across the nation, and it has been suggested that 98% of the country was using Greenwich Mean Time by the mid-1850s. But even then, local mean time in rare instances prevailed. Some communities rejected the imposition of the metropolitan way. Timetables for September 1859 for the Shrewsbury, Hereford and Newport area, printed in newspapers, stated that Greenwich time was to be followed, but expressed some frustration with this situation. Quote, The clocks are set to Greenwich time and are faster 11 minutes than those of the district ought to be. Only in 1860 did many places in the West Country accept railway time fully, whilst in 1874 the Town Council of Stoke rejected a proposal to regulate the church clock by railway time. Small pockets of local mean time therefore remained throughout Britain until 1880, when the Statutes Definition of Time Act legally mandated Greenwich Mean Time nationwide. Even then, this law was not initiated because of the railway. The purpose of the Act was, quote, to remove doubts as to the meaning of expressions relative to time occurring in Acts of Parliament, deeds, and other legal instruments. The Act was therefore a response to the need for administrative uniformity. As such, whilst being a significant factor in the standardisation of time across Britain, the railways were not the only influence on this process.